The Dark Scrolls. Under the dim glow of flickering candles, a single parchment is drawn from the dust of forgotten archives. Its edges are frayed, its ink uneven, but the story it contains still breathes, heavy with incense of mystery and power. From these brittle pages rises the figure of Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor who chose not the battlefield or council chamber as his stage, but the shadowed corridors of Prague Castle, where alchemy, astrology, and the arts of the hidden became the true currency of his reign. His name would come to embody both the brilliance of Renaissance curiosity and the descent into obsession, as his court transformed into a sanctuary of seekers, dreamers, and those who trafficked in forbidden knowledge. The late 16th century was a time when Europe, torn between faith and reform, crowned rulers not only with scepters but also with the burden of survival in an age of fracture. It was into this shifting world that Rudolf inherited his throne, carrying the vast weight of the Habsburg legacy, yet seeking to forge a path that belonged not to sword and statecraft, but to the occult pursuit of truth, veiled from the ordinary eye. The halls of Prague soon bore witness to a gathering unlike any other in Europe. Where once knights sharpened steel, now philosophers debated the properties of mercury and sulfur. Where generals mapped campaigns, magi traced planetary conjunctions in ink upon vellum. Rudolf was less a sovereign than a collector of souls. Painters, mathematicians, alchemists, and astrologers found their way to his side, lured by his insatiable hunger for the hidden. His collections of mechanical marvels and natural curiosities grew to rival those of ancient kings, a cabinet of wonders that whispered of both divine creation and human ambition. Yet beneath this glittering surface lay a darker current. Whispered records suggest Rudolf sought not merely the admiration of scholars, but the mastery of forces beyond mortal grasp. The philosopher's stone, the elixir of eternal life, the power to summon or banish spirits. Some claimed he succeeded in experiments that defied reason. Others muttered of failure, delusion, and descent into madness. In these accounts, one can glimpse both the majesty and fragility of a man who held half of Europe in name, but whose heart was bound to dreams more elusive than crowns or kingdoms. As the years unfurled, Prague became the axis of strange pilgrimages. Men of science and secrecy, their names etched in marginalia of codices and the margins of fading manuscripts, converged upon Rudolf's capital. The emperor granted them patronage, but also demanded that their arts feed his own restless desire. A comet crossing the sky could suspend all counsel, for Rudolf would insist on charting its meaning with his astrologers. Political petitions went unanswered, drowned beneath the clinking of alembics and the hiss of furnaces in the alchemical workshops. Yet within this atmosphere of arcane obsession, true genius also flourished. Observations of the heavens laid foundations for the future of astronomy. Works of art, commissioned under Rudolf's gaze, captured the strange synthesis of the divine and grotesque. Still, each triumph was shadowed by a question. Did the emperor's devotion to mysteries enrich his empire, or did it weaken the very authority entrusted to him? Historians debate, but the records whisper that his neglect of politics allowed enemies to gather, both outside the castle walls and within his own family. The fractures came, as they must. Brothers, cousins, and courtiers grew impatient with a sovereign who seemed more concerned with transmuting lead into gold than with governing lands of men. Schemes unfolded in the silence of corridors, alliances shifted, betrayal brewed. Rudolf's empire, so vast in theory, became fragile in practice, as rivals seized upon his reputation for eccentricity to strip him of power. Accounts describe him barricading himself within the castle, surrounded by works of art and alchemical treatises, as though these talismans could shield him from the encroaching reality of dispossession. Some chroniclers describe the spectacle with pity, others with scorn. An emperor who had once been master of realms, now master only of chambers filled with dust and dreams. Yet there lingers a suspicion that Rudolf, in his seclusion, touched upon knowledge forbidden to others, glimpsing realms that lay beyond crowns and treaties, paying a price in sanity for revelations unfit for mortal minds. Whether this is truth or legend remains unresolved, left for those who ponder the blurred border between genius and madness. When Rudolf finally departed this world in 1612, his body interred with the dignity befitting his station, his legacy remained far less secure. His successors reclaimed the mantle of pragmatic rule, but could not erase the aura that clung to his name. In Prague, stories persisted of laboratories sealed with secrets, manuscripts hidden with thin walls, and a ghostly emperor who walked by candlelight through deserted halls, forever seeking the formula he had never found in life. His collections, scattered across Europe, would shape the museums and libraries of later centuries, silent reminders of a reign where art and occult sought common ground. To some, Rudolf II stands as a patron of knowledge ahead of his age, whose obsessions seeded future revolutions of thought. To others, he remains a cautionary emblem of a ruler undone by private fixations, blind to the harsher demands of empire. Between these poles lies the truth, an emperor who turned his throne into an altar of mysteries, who summoned both wonder and ruin, whose shadow still lingers in Prague stones, as though waiting for a new hand to unseal the secrets he so desperately pursued. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Prague Castle, in chambers that had once echoed with the solemn decrees of kings, there arose a new kind of dominion, less visible than armies, yet no less commanding. Rudolf II, having inherited the imperial crown in 1576, bore the lineage of Habsburg sovereignty upon his shoulders. But unlike his ancestors, whose ambitions marched with banners across Europe's bloodied fields, Rudolf chose to root his reign in the sanctum of his chosen capital. He turned from Vienna, with its heavy weight of politics and proximity to the constant menace of Ottoman expansion, and he fixed his eyes on Prague, a city of winding alleys, Gothic spires, and river mist that seemed already half attuned to secrets. To transplant the imperial seat there was itself an act of departure, a statement that this emperor would not rule by precedent. In Prague, he gathered not merely administrators and nobles, but an entourage unlike any Europe had ever seen. He summoned mathematicians who figures mapped the heavens, painters whose canvases unraveled the hidden allegories of nature, clockmakers whose delicate wheels turned with near supernatural precision. Chroniclers wrote that he wandered through his halls like a collector of living talismans, each scholar and craftsman serving as a fragment of the greater riddle he sought to solve. There are accounts that his very court seemed less a council chamber than an alchemical laboratory, with flasks simmering, furnaces roaring, and whispers of arcane incantations rising with the smoke. The emperor's fascination did not emerge in a vacuum. The 16th century was already an age where knowledge strained against the confines of dogma. The Reformation had cracked the once unified church, and in its wake, intellectual currents sought new anchors. Astrology, long dismissed as superstition by theologians, reasserted itself under the patronage of rulers who read omens in the heavens to justify or question the course of wars. Alchemy, with its veiled promises of transmutation and immortality, became a language in which philosophers, physicians, and charlatans alike conversed. Rudolf, however, elevated these pursuits from curiosity to central obsession. He did not merely tolerate them, he demanded them, and he funded them with imperial treasure that others would have poured into soldiers or fortresses. Among those he drew into his orbit were men whose names still resonate. John Dee, the English magus who conversed with angels through scrying stones. Tycho Brahe, the Danish nobleman whose instruments mapped the firmament with unprecedented accuracy. Johannes Kepler, the mathematician whose calculations would shatter the crystal spheres of medieval cosmology. These figures found in Prague both refuge and opportunity. Some came willingly, compelled by Rudolf's reputation as a patron of the extraordinary. Others, it is whispered, came at his insistent summons, reluctant yet unable to refuse the emperor's will.
In the walls of the castle, their destinies intersected, their labors both genuine and esoteric, their allegiance tested between the demands of science and the expectations of a sovereign hungry for results that defied nature. The emperor himself did not merely observe but participated. Records suggest he studied manuscripts in solitude, tracing symbols of alchemy with his own hand. He acquired volumes banned elsewhere, grimoires that whispered of theurgy and necromancy, their bindings singed with suspicion of fire. It is said he could spend entire nights poring over diagrams of celestial conjunctions, seeking not only knowledge but revelation. Witnesses reported him pale and withdrawn, with eyes sunk deep, as if perpetually haunted by visions glimpsed beyond the veil. Some wondered whether he sought in these mysteries not only the philosopher's stone, but also an answer to his own frailties. For Rudolf, though emperor, was subject to melancholia, to fits of despair that no crown could banish. As Prague's reputation grew, so too did the strange tapestry of those who gathered under Rudolf's patronage. Jewish mystics from the city's ghetto were said to advise him, weaving Kabbalistic insights into his quests. Artisans brought him automata that moved like living beings, whispering of souls trapped in gears and cogs. Painters gifted him portraits in which saints and demons mingled, allegories that blurred the sacred and the profane. His Kunstkammer, the Cabinet of Wonders, became a repository where exotic beasts, crystals of impossible hue, and relics both sacred and dubious were displayed side by side. To step into these chambers was to step into the emperor's mind, a cosmos where the boundaries between natural philosophy, superstition, and art dissolved into a single, haunting vision. But while Rudolf pursued the hidden, the visible realm of empire began to strain. His absence from Vienna was felt as neglect, his detachment from political necessities a void into which rivals pressed. Reports circulated of diets and councils left unanswered, of petitions piling while the emperor locked himself in chambers perfumed with mercury and incense. Foreign ambassadors returned home with stories not of decisive policies, but of an emperor lost in dreams. Some regarded Prague as a new Alexandria of knowledge, others as a court bewitched, where empire waned even as the occult waxed. Both views contained fragments of truth, for Rudolf's reign was a paradox, fertile soil for discoveries that would shape modern science, yet also a stage upon which the authority of crown and sword seemed ever more fragile. It is difficult to distinguish fact from rumor in these records, for Rudolf's court was shrouded in deliberate secrecy. Certain manuscripts describe rituals held at night,
where the emperor himself presided, robed in symbols, before altars of alchemical glassware. There are notes of experiments meant to summon elemental forces, of circles inscribed to ward against spirits. Irits. Whether these were acts of true belief or theatrical performances to impress and test his alchemists is uncertain. Scholars argue still whether Rudolf was a credulous devotee or a cunning patron who manipulated the language of the occult to bind his followers in awe. Yet the testimony of those closest to him, preserved in letters and memoirs, speaks of a man driven by forces deeper than curiosity, a sovereign whose identity was inseparable from the hidden arts he embraced. The transformation of Prague under Rudolf cannot be overstated. The city itself became a palimpsest of the emperor's will. Towers were raised not only as defenses, but as observatories. Workshops proliferated, their chimneys sending forth the smoke of experiments whose purpose few could fathom. Taverns hummed with talk of philosophers and charlatans, for the emperor's patronage had blurred the line between scholar and fraud. Even the common folk whispered that their ruler consorted with spirits, that omens of the skies were interpreted not for the realm's safety, but for his private hunger. Some feared, others marveled, but all recognized that they lived in the shadow of an emperor unlike any before. By the closing years of the 16th century, Rudolf's identity as a ruler was no longer measured by campaigns or treaties, but by the strange assembly he had drawn into Prague's embrace. The city's reputation spread across Europe as a place where the future was being written, though in what script, scientific or sorcerous, none could say. Within the castle walls, men pursued equations that would shape astronomy, while in the next chamber, others whispered incantations over crucibles. And presiding over it all was Rudolf, the emperor who had made himself high priest of an empire of mystery. His throne was surrounded not by knights in armor, but by seekers of hidden fire, by charts of planets and symbols inscribed in gold. Whether this was vision or folly, destiny or delusion, would only become clear. When the weight of neglected empire came to press upon him. The chronicles pause here, leaving us to reflect upon the image of an emperor enthroned in secrecy, his empire both enriched and imperiled by his obsessions. Rudolf's Prague was a crucible where knowledge, art, and arcana fused, giving birth to wonders, yet also shadows. And as we turn the parchment to its next page, we sense that the story of this sovereign will not end in triumph, but in conflict between the dreamer and the world that demanded more than dreams. The parchment shifts beneath cautious hands, revealing the deeper scars of Rudolf's reign. If the early years at Prague had been cloaked in the perfume of wonder, the decades that followed revealed the weight of empire pressing down upon a sovereign who preferred the stillness of astrolabes to the clangor of arms. In theory, Rudolf held dominion over vast territories, stretching from the sun-scorched plains of Spain to the frost of the Low Countries, and from the Italian principalities to the restless lands of Hungary. In practice, the very breadth of the Habsburg inheritance was fractured by endless quarrels, by the unceasing drum of war against the Ottoman frontier, and by the poisoned rivalry of Catholic and Protestant within the empire's own borders. At first, his contemporaries hoped Rudolf might steady this storm. He had been educated in Spain, reared at the court of Philip II, where discipline and ritual formed the marrow of power. Those who supported his accession imagined, but a ruler who could blend Habsburg authority with Spanish resolve. Yet once enthroned, Rudolf withdrew ever deeper into the solitude of Prague, reluctant to ride at the head of armies or to bind his will to decisive councils. Imperial diets convened, grievances were aired, but the emperor often remained absent, choosing instead to gaze upon planetary charts while his advisors struggled to interpret his silences. The empire's enemies did not pause for his hesitation. Along the eastern frontier, the Ottoman advance pressed relentlessly. Reports arrived of sieges and massacres, of border fortresses collapsing beneath Turkish cannon. It was under Rudolf's reign that the Long Turkish War ignited, a conflict stretching from 1593 to 1606, remembered for its brutality and futility. Habsburg banners marched, allied with forces from Transylvania and Wallachia, yet the campaigns achieved little beyond devastation. Victories, when they came, were costly and fleeting. Defeats gnawed at the edges of imperial authority. Chroniclers note Rudolf's hand in directing the war was minimal. His commands issued through intermediaries, his personal presence at the battlefield nearly non-existent. Soldiers spoke of an emperor who demanded sacrifice, yet withheld his face from their cause. Amid this turbulence, religion carved the empire into bitter halves. The Protestant Reformation, decades old, still bled across the lands, and Rudolf's equivocal stance pleased neither camp. At times he courted Catholic zeal, attempting to enforce the counter-reformation within his dominions. At other moments he extended concessions to Protestant nobles, seeking to calm their discontent. Each wavering stroke deepened distrust. Princes whispered that the emperor's mind was clouded, not merely by melancholia, but by the fumes of alchemical furnaces. Some suspected he governed not by reason, but by omens, shaping decrees according to the interpretations of astrologers. Whether true or exaggerated, such rumors eroded his stature in the eyes of those who yearned for a sovereign of steel rather than smoke. Even within his own household, fractures widened. Rudolf never married, never secured legitimate heirs, and this absence of dynastic certainty festered. His brothers, particularly Matthias, eyed both his crown and his perceived weakness. Matthias proved himself more pragmatic, more willing to court the alliances Rudolf spurned, and gradually drew support away from Prague. Letters preserved from these years reveal the bitterness that spread between siblings, the one cloaked in study, the other sharpening ambition. Betrayal did not arrive with sudden force, but with steady attrition. Courtiers shifting allegiance, cities pledging loyalty to Matthias, while Rudolf withdrew further into his sanctum of manuscripts. The emperor's greatest trial emerged in Bohemia itself, the very heart of his chosen dominion. There, Protestant nobles demanded religious freedoms, rights of worship that Rudolf hesitated to grant. For years, tension simmered, until in 1609, under immense pressure, he issued the Letter of Majesty, a document conceding liberties that he had resisted for decades. To some, it was a triumph, a moment when the emperor recognized the pluralism of his realm. To others, it was capitulation, proof of his inability to assert authority. Even the act of concession was poisoned by division, for Rudolf's belated generosity could not erase the years of suspicion, nor prevent further unrest. In fact, his signature on that document signaled his waning grasp, as power bled from his hand to that of nobles emboldened by his weakness. Throughout these crises, the emperor's reputation hardened into paradox.
He was remembered for grand collections, for the marvels of art and science fostered under his watch, yet simultaneously cursed for his negligence in affairs of state. Foreign ambassadors, returning from Prague, described halls overflowing with curiosities, but courts bereft of decision. They recounted audiences in which Rudolf stared intently upon a celestial globe, while matters of war hung unanswered in the air. Some mocked him as bewitched, others pitied him as captive of his own mind. Yet even in their derision, they acknowledged the strange aura that clung to him, as though he trod upon a threshold others feared to cross. The long Turkish war dragged on, consuming men and coin, until exhaustion compelled the Treaty of Zsitvatorok in 1606. This settlement, while halting hostilities, marked no resounding victory. It conceded parity to the Sultan, ending the notion of Habsburg superiority over the Ottoman Porte. For a dynasty built on prestige, this was humiliation. Rudolf bore the blame, his authority eroded not only by military stalemate, but by his estrangement from his own commanders. In the wake of the treaty, Matthias moved decisively, seizing control of Hungary, Austria, and Moravia with the backing of estates weary of Rudolf's indecision. The emperor, once magic, stare of realms, found himself confined to the narrow refuge of Bohemia, his authority stripped by the very kin who had sworn loyalty. The records from Rudolf's final years read like the closing act of a tragedy. His isolation deepened. He trusted fewer advisors, locked himself within castle chambers surrounded by portraits, automata, and manuscripts. At times he lashed out, attempting feeble intrigues against Matthias, but his efforts collapsed under the weight of reality. By 1611, his brother entered Prague with overwhelming support, and Rudolf was compelled to abdicate the crown of Bohemia, the last dominion he still held. Chroniclers note that the once imperial figure appeared ghost-like, pale, broken, a shadow who wandered his palace halls as a prisoner among his own treasures. Yet even amid ruin, Prague still pulsed with the strange vitality Rudolf had sown. Scientists continued their work. Artists left behind canvases of haunting brilliance, and alchemical laboratories remained active long after his authority dissolved. It is as if the emperor, though defeated in the realm of politics, succeeded in binding the city to his vision of mystery. Whether this was triumph or folly depends upon the eye of the beholder. In the end, Rudolf's reign was a tapestry woven with contradiction. Wars fought without victory, concessions granted too late, brothers who turned to rivals, faiths he could not reconcile. To judge him solely by these failures is to ignore the peculiar glow that illuminated Prague in his time. But to excuse him entirely is impossible, for his neglect sowed seeds of discontent that would erupt after his death, feeding the fires of the 30 Years' War. What remains clear is that Rudolf, more than most, embodied the peril of a ruler who placed the pursuit of hidden truths above the governance of men. The parchment here grows heavy, ink smudged by centuries of retelling, but the impression remains. An emperor crowned not in glory of conquest, but in the air haze of obsession, undone not by enemies alone, but by the ghosts he pursued within his own mind. The parchment deepens in tone, its script heavy with sorrow, as the tale moves toward the waning of Rudolf's life. The emperor who once presided over an empire of mysteries found himself ensnared in a more cruel alchemy, the transmutation of sovereign majesty into isolation, of authority into shadows.
Where once courtiers filled his halls with debate and artisans unveiled marvels before his gaze, now corridors stretched silent, broken only by the echo of footsteps that belonged to a ruler no longer obeyed. The betrayal that most haunted Rudolf was not that of foreign princes or rebellious nobles, but of his own blood. Matthias, the younger brother who had once stood deferential in his presence, had risen against him with the stealth of a serpent. It was not sudden but gradual, a patient erosion of loyalty, as nobles and estates weary of Rudolf's indecision found in Matthias the strength and decisiveness their emperor could not provide. By 1608, Matthias had secured control of Hungary, Austria, and Moravia, leaving Rudolf hemmed into Bohemia, a sovereign reduced to a fragment of his once vast inheritance. The empire that had stretched across Christendom was being carved away piece by piece, while the emperor himself watched with a bitterness too deep for words. Those close to Rudolf in these years describe a man consumed by suspicion. His melancholy hardened into paranoia. He trusted fewer voices, dismissed servants, and retreated into chambers locked from within. Ministers who once advised him with frankness now trembled before his gaze, for the emperor's moods were unpredictable, at times silent for hours, staring upon an astrological chart, at others erupting in sudden rage, railing against imagined conspiracies. Chroniclers whisper that he spoke of plots woven not only by men but by spirits, that he saw signs in the flight of birds or the crack of thunder, interpreting them as portents of betrayal. Whether these were the hallucinations of a mind fraying under pressure, Ishur, or the fragments of visions only he could see, remains uncertain. The Kunstkammer, once a cabinet of wonder, became in these years a mausoleum of obsession. Automata stood motionless, their gears rusting. Curiosities gathered dust. Portraits gazed down upon a sovereign who no longer summoned scholars to admire them. Rudolf wandered among them alone, touching each relic as though it might speak to him, as though the fragments of nature and art he had gathered could offer the companionship denied by men. There are accounts of him seated before the grotesque allegories painted by Arcimboldo, staring into faces composed of fruits and stones, as if seeking dialogue with symbols. To some observers, it seemed the emperor lived more among images than among flesh. The court itself thinned. Where once Prague had thrived with scholars, alchemists, and astrologers, now many had departed, driven away by lack of funds or by Matthias's encroaching authority. Kepler left to serve other patrons. Tycho Brahe had long since died. His instruments passed on. Even the charlatans, once so eager to exploit imperial favor, withdrew when Rudolf's coffers ran dry and his temper grew sharp. The emperor who had gathered the greatest constellation of minds in Europe now walked beneath an empty sky, his companions reduced to the shadows of memory. In 1611, the final blow fell. Matthias marched upon Prague with overwhelming force, supported by estates who no longer feared Rudolf's displeasure. The emperor attempted resistance, barricading himself within the castle, but his efforts were feeble. Reports suggest he wandered the halls, clutching keys to chambers long sealed, as if possession of hidden rooms might substitute for armies. Servants watched him mutter over astrological charts, seeking in the heavens a sign that fate might yet reverse. But no comet or conjunction appeared to stay his downfall. In the end, he was compelled to abdicate the crown of Bohemia, surrendering the last remnant of real authority. The abdication was not celebrated with grandeur, but enacted with quiet humiliation, a formality that reduced the once universal monarch to a prisoner within his own palace.
After this, Rudolf became a figure almost spectral. His body remained in Prague Castle, but his presence seemed half withdrawn from the world. Accounts describe him moving through corridors at night by candlelight, his robes trailing like shadows, his face pale and lined. Servants whispered of hearing him converse with unseen companions, perhaps memories, perhaps spirits, perhaps the demons of his mind. Some claimed he still conducted experiments in secret, mixing powders and liquids, invoking rituals as though he might yet summon the stone that would redeem his fall. Others insisted he merely sat in silence, staring into furnaces that had long since gone cold. The emperor's health declined swiftly. Years of melancholy, neglect, and solitude had sapped his strength. Physicians attended him, prescribing elixirs and prayers, but nothing could reverse the decay. Even as his body weakened, Rudolf clung to his collections, demanding to be surrounded by his curiosities. In those final months, the Kunstkammer became both throne and tomb. He would have relics brought to his bedside, holding crystals to catch candlelight, murmuring over coins etched with ancient symbols, as though seeking in them the answer denied by crowns and councils. It is said that in these last days he confided to a few trusted attendants his fear that he had failed, not only as ruler but as seeker. He had pursued the hidden with relentless devotion, yet the philosopher's stone had eluded him, immortality remained ungrasped, and even the loyalty of his family had turned to dust. He feared that posterity would judge him not as a patron of knowledge, but as a madman. And perhaps this fear was justified, for even now scholars debate whether his court was the seedbed of science or the asylum of delusion. Rudolf II of Bohemia, that in 1612, alone in the castle, he had made both palace and prison. His passing was recorded with the dignity due his rank, yet there was little rejoicing, little mourning beyond the ritual. The empire had already moved on. Matthias installed in his stead, pragmatic and firm, where Rudolf had been hesitant and obscure. Yet even as power shifted, the city of Prague remained haunted by the memory of the emperor who had turned it into an alchemical dream. Legends soon rose. Servants spoke of candlelight flickering in deserted chambers, of the faint echo of footsteps long after the halls had been cleared. Some swore they saw Rudolf's figure moving among the relics of the Kunstkammer, still cataloguing, still seeking. Scholars who visited years later claimed to sense his presence in the observatories, as though the emperor's spirit lingered, unwilling to depart while his questions remained unanswered. Whether these tales were superstition or truth mattered little, for they bound Rudolf to Prague, as indelibly as any monument. Thus his end was not a dramatic fall upon the battlefield, nor an execution at the hands of rebels, but a slow dissolution into silence, a man consumed by his obsessions, until nothing remained but shadow. His life's arc stands as both warning and wonder, the sovereign who turned away from politics to embrace mysteries, who fostered art and science yet neglected his people, who inspired marvels yet also despair. The parchment here darkens, its script fading, as though even memory recoils from the sadness of an emperor whose greatest tragedy was not defeat by others, but the abyss he carved within himself. The final sheets of this ancient record carry not the noise of battles nor the clash of factions, but the long echo of a life transfigured into memory. Rudolf II was laid to rest, his body consigned to imperial tombs, yet his reign did not vanish with the lowering of stone and seal. Rather,
It persisted in fragments scattered across Europe, in paintings that bore his patronage, in instruments forged under his command, in manuscripts written at his behest, and in the uneasy legends whispered about him for centuries thereafter. His death marked the end of an emperor, but not the end of the shadows he had cast. The first legacy to endure was his vast treasury of art. Rudolph's appetite for collecting was insatiable. He gathered works with the same fervor others amassed armies. His court had become a magnet for artists, and even after his fall, the canvases remained. Portraits by Arcimboldo, grotesque and allegorical, survived as unsettling reflections of his fascination with the strange order of nature. Sculptures, coins, and engravings commissioned under his gaze carried into posterity the visual texture of a court where reality and symbolism intertwined. Later generations, encountering these works in scattered collections, discerned in them the mark of an emperor who saw in art not mere ornament, but revelation. The Kunstkammer itself, though dispersed by war and conquest, seeded museums across the continent, its fragments forming the backbone of collections in Vienna, Dresden, and beyond. In science, too, his shadow lingered. Tycho Brahe's instruments, funded by imperial support, allowed Johannes Kepler to refine his laws of planetary motion, laws that would dismantle the medieval cosmos and open the path to Newton. Without Rudolph's peculiar willingness to fund the astronomers who unsettled orthodoxy, the progress of science might have slowed. Indeed, Kepler's great work, the Rudolphine Tables, bore the emperor's name, a monument in calculation to a ruler more faithful to stars than to men. Yet this triumph was not unmixed, for Rudolf himself never grasped the full import of the discoveries he enabled. He sought in the heavens confirmation of fate and prophecy, not the mechanical laws that would redefine the universe. His patronage, whether deliberate or accidental, became the paradox of a man whose obsessions paved the way for truths he never intended. Alchemy, that most elusive of pursuits, also clung to his memory. Though no philosopher's stone emerged from his furnaces, the tradition of inquiry he encouraged kept alive the experimental spirit that would one day mature into chemistry. To his contemporaries, Rudolf remained the emperor who might have unlocked the secrets of transmutation, who perhaps held formulas hidden still within sealed vaults of Prague Castle. Legends flourished of manuscripts concealed in walls, of crypts where mercury still dripped in perpetual distillation. Some tales insisted that Rudolf had indeed succeeded, that he had still come, had glimpsed the elixir of life, but chosen silence. Whether truth or myth, the persistence of such stories demonstrates the aura he left. A sovereign remembered not for decrees, but for secrets he may or may not have touched. Yet his legacy was not only one of wonder. The failures of his reign bore consequences that outlived him. The divisions he could not heal between Protestant and Catholic, the concessions granted too late, the weakness displayed in the face of Matthias's usurpation. All these fed into the greater conflagration that erupted after his death. The 30 Years' War, which scarred Europe from 1618 to 1648, cannot be traced solely to Rudolf, but his indecision and inability to reconcile his empire's factions contributed to the tinder. In this sense, his reign became a cautionary chapter, remembered by statesmen as a warning of what befalls when a ruler retreats from politics into obsession. Prague itself bore his imprint most deeply. The city that he chose as his capital need foreshed the aura of strangeness he bestowed. Even after imperial power withdrew, the legends remained. Tales of secret laboratories, of the golem, said to have walked its Jewish quarter under his tacit protection, of hidden chambers beneath the castle, where experiments continued long after Rudolph's death. Visitors spoke of an atmosphere unlike any other in Europe, a mingling of Gothic stone and alchemical rumor, as if the very air had absorbed the emperor's dreams. Centuries later, writers, artists, and mystics would return to Prague in search of that same aura, drawing upon Rudolph's shadow as inspiration. Modern historians have struggled to define him. Was he a madman, lost in melancholia and delusion, whose neglect brought ruin upon his house? Was he a visionary, a patron of inquiry, whose support of art and science laid foundations for the modern age? The record refuses simple answers. He was both and neither, a man whose contradictions resist reduction. His life demonstrates the peril of obsession, yet also the unexpected fruits it can bear. The very discoveries that reshaped astronomy might never have been made without his peculiar patronage. Yet his political failures helped plunge Europe into one of its darkest wars. His reign, therefore, becomes a mirror, reflecting both brilliance and folly, genius and ruin. Beyond history, Rudolph's figure passed into legend, his name invoked in works of fiction, his castle imagined as a labyrinth of hidden knowledge. Poets wrote of him as the emperor who sought eternity. Occultists claimed him as a precursor, a royal initiate into mysteries. Even in popular memory, he survives less as ruler than as seeker, his crown overshadowed by crucibles and astrolabes. The persistence of his legend reveals a fascination with rulers who step outside the ordinary, who abandon the pragmatic for the perilous quest of hidden truth. In this, Rudolf joins a lineage of figures who haunt the margins of history, remembered not for victory, but for obsession. Perhaps this is his truest legacy, that he reminds us of the human hunger for mysteries beyond power, beyond reason. In his solitude, in his failures, in his endless pursuit of secrets never fully revealed, Rudolf embodies the paradox of knowledge itself. The closer one approaches, the more it recedes, leaving behind not certainty, but shadows. The parchment that preserves his story ends not with a clear verdict, but with silence, as though even history hesitates to judge him. And so the tale closes, not in triumph nor in condemnation, but in the uneasy recognition that Rudolf II remains suspended between genius and madness, between science and sorcery, between the crown he wore and the secrets he chased. His body lies in stone, but his shadow lingers in Prague's mist, in the silent halls of museums that display his treasures, in the equations of astronomy that still bear his name, and in the whispers of those who say that on certain nights, a pale figure still walks the chart. Castle corridors, candle in hand, searching for the secret that eluded him in life. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.